Welcome to the Sword Sorcery contemporary version, I guess, contemporary work. So we got 15 minutes to talk about where Sword Sorcery is going in the future and now. We got a great panel and one more coming, Dedren, Snead. So I'm Seth Lindberg. I do some editing for Blackgate Magazine, and I do a fair amount of publishing on the amateur level of Sword Sorcery. And this is a great passion of mine. And we're going to jump into introductions once I do some housework here. So I need to pitch the Writer Symposium USB drive. If you're not familiar with it, it's available up front. It's last year this was like $35. This year it's only $20. It has contributions from most of the authors in the Writer Symposium. It has a couple audiobooks, a bunch of novels. Kat Rambo put a whole training on how to write a horror story in here. There's a couple video games, because we have video, I don't know what format they are, but we have a lot of video game designers and writers as part of this. And also all the electronic versions of the anthology they put together this year is also in here. So this year marks the return of anthology associated with the event. That's available in paperback up front for like $25. And so this is a steal for $20. And the proceeds mostly go toward getting other authors here for next year. So we have like a travel fund. And we really like to bring in some marginalized authors or authors from afar, and we need money to do that. So you can help out the symposium and get a bunch of great work for $20. So check that out at the front.
And where up front can they find it?
Yeah, there's like a coat check kiosk thing near the where you walked in. So if you head toward that, and there's a couple people manning that. Awesome. Okay, so we actually originally had Sarah Sharp, an author, allocated to be part of the panel, and she had to withdraw. So she's not here, but we have most of our panelists. So let's start in with the introductions on who's here. So Jason, why don't you get started?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Jason Ray Carney. My main job is I'm a professor of English at Christopher Newport University, which is in Tidewater, Virginia. I think the reason why I'm on this panel is because I founded Spiral Tower Press. It's a independent press. We publish a zine, Whetstone, amateur magazine of Sword and Sorcery. We did that for about 4 years, 8 issues. We're on a hiatus right now because we do 2 other zines, one for Cosmic Horror and one for Space Opera. But I've published an anthology of Sword and Sorcery, Rakefire and other stories, and I think that's just kind of been part of Sword and Sorcery fandom for a long time, and Robert E. Howard fandom. A lot of my scholarship actually treats the Between the Wars period, specifically pulp fiction, and so Robert E. Howard is a big author for me in terms of scholarship. So,
can you guys hear at the back? You okay?
Sorry.
Can you use our?
Yeah, we didn't get microphones, did we?
We can use our outside voices.
This size of a room doesn't get a microphone. So pretend you're Conan here. Yeah.
Well, I'll project a little bit.
Sorry, am I being too quiet?
I'm Howard Andrew Jones, and I've been editing and writing Sword and Sorcery for, gosh, at this point, decades, and promoting it. I was the managing editor of Blackgate Magazine. Until very recently, I was the editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull, so for its first 5 years, the first 12 issues. And I have been writing Sword and Sorcery of some flavor for many years, but most recently for Bain. They signed me to a 5-book contract, and the first 2 books are out, starting with Lord of a Shattered Land. Book 3 will be coming out in October. And the first 2 books are now available in trade paperback. Originally, they were just out in hardback. I am just having a blast writing these books, and I think a lot of readers are enjoying them. So I hope you give them a shot.
Thank you, Howard. I am Matthew John. I am not wearing a hat, but I wear many hats, as it were. I do work for Monolith Board Games, though our most recent project is this Conan role-playing game, even though we do a Conan board game. So this is coming to Kickstarter in October. If you're interested in that sort of thing, it's a streamlined, lighter approach to the system. You can get to the table real quick. I am also one of the talking heads on the Rogues in the House podcast, so if you are into swords and sorcery, and especially contemporary authors and things like that, we talk all of that material we're kind of funny sometimes, so it's worth checking out the Rogues in the House. And if you don't know where that name comes from, I'm surprised to see you here, but that's okay. I recently released this book, To Walk on Worlds. This is a compilation of many stories I've had published in a bunch of venues, including The Magician's Skull. And now I've got my own little collection out. It's stories that kind of create a narrative whole, but are all work independently, so please do check that out after you check out Howard's books, because they're probably better.
Aw.
Dedren, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. It just kind of sound like I wrote it here on the boards. Just getting here, so I hope everyone's doing well. My name is Dedren Snead from Atlanta, Georgia. Writer, artist, creator under some studios, and working in our space of sword and sorcery, or as we have as our niche of sword and soul, looking at the space where inclusive storytelling and narratives from underrepresented spaces in science fiction and fantasy can find a home in space, not only in written space, but also in the gaming space. And so a traditional game developer, but also working to work in tabletop. Had a couple of things here and there, but the idea is that, yes, we want to see the table space just have more seats for those that may not have felt invited before. And so for me, my main work is Sword and the Spear. It's an African fantasy about girls that beat up monsters. So we've been working on that with a group of creators from all spaces and spectrums, and working on a tabletop version of this now. So appreciate the opportunity and time to connect here.
Awesome. We also have a crew member here, Sean, doing our filming. Can you introduce yourself too?
My name is Sean C.W. Korsgaard. I am a U.S. Army veteran, an award-winning photojournalist, formerly an editor at Bang Books, and currently the editor-in-chief at Iron Age Media, where I am launching a sword and sorcery magazine, Battleborn. Please check out the website, Battleborn Magazine. Hope to see you guys subscribe, throw out the Kickstarter, and most importantly, submitting.
Awesome, thanks.
Seats at the front too.
Yeah, we got a couple seats up here.
Yep.
Not many
Just
left.
come in late and get the best one if you want.
Right. So we're going to focus on the contemporary stuff. We'll first cover, just for 5 or 10 minutes, the classic view of where Sword Sorcery was, but I don't want to linger on it, but we should address it.
Sure.
And then I want to make sure I talk to you guys in the crowd. I want to get a rough feel of where you guys want to go with this. I don't know. I want to see if like how many of you feel like you're on the an aspiring writer with like more writing advice versus a fan. So we'll see how much do you lean more toward being a writer? Ish. Okay. How about you just like to read and stuff, and you're more of a fan?
Okay.
All right. So we got a good mix of both. If you have questions, raise your hand. I'll do my best to work it in, and we'll definitely save room or time at the end to get those. Okay. So I don't want to linger on it, but I think if you had to give a 30-second elevator speech where most people would define sword and sorcery of the past, how would you do that? That makes sense. Just because, so I don't know.
No pressure.
No pressure, Jason.
30 seconds?
Or yeah, I'll throw you under the bus first. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right. So the more I've been part of Sword and Sorcery fandom, I'm starting to think that the real issue is the tension between like epic fantasy storytelling and Sword and Sorcery storytelling. So epic fantasy, the stakes are really high. The world is going to end if this group of heroes, it tends to be a group of heroes, don't save the day. Where Sword and Sorcery is more focused on a single person, maybe a duo, and the stakes are really low. Let's get enough money to go carousing at the end, or there's a monster that we need to save this one village from. So so that's my, I guess, really quick distinction between Sword and Sorcery.
Don't forget the pacing.
On the pacing, yeah, the pacing tends to be, it's accelerated towards conflict. There's not a lot of introspection, I guess you would say. The characters act before they think. There's a lot more there I'm resisting because I don't want to keep going.
I would maybe just add it, and this is somewhat contentious, but Sword and Sorcery tends to have its tradition in short fiction, and even like with Howard's books or my book, it's kind of told in the short form that creates a narrative whole. So even these Howard's sort of doorstoppers here, function on that level. And I don't think that's always the case, but there definitely is that tradition baked in, which lends itself to more breakneck pace too, right? Yeah.
Dedren, do you have a few?
Well, absolutely. I think as Jason cited and was said there, I feel like there's a more localized understanding of where the worlds are. Of course, when we think of epic fantasy, we're looking at, is to stop and smell the flowers. I think for Sword and Sorcery, it's the world only exists at the end of our hero or heroine's blade, right? It's only as far as the next tavern. But I think in taking those types of stories, you get that more intimate introspection of how the character sees the world. And from there, it a lot of times is immutable, where I think other heroes or heroines learn their lesson. I love to think that Sword and Sorcery, they don't learn their lesson, and that's what we like about it.
One other ingredient I would probably have to put in there is the horror, right? Sword and Sorcery is very, the Venn diagram leans a little more into horror with that than epic fantasy, I would say, overall. Not all Swords and Sorcery has a strictly horrific element, but I would say most typically does, or a weird element, capital W maybe.
Well, let's talk about magic as well. In a lot of epic fantasy, the magic is almost like a science where it's well delineated and often controlled. In Sword and Sorcery, it's this malefic, hard to control element that is very dangerous, and it's almost never beneficial. Very occasionally, but most of the time, no. It's dangerous and not to be trifled with. And also, I touched on momentum and pacing before, but we didn't talk about the characters are often more fully formed individuals. In epic fantasy, so often they're a young person coming to grips with their power, and we follow along while they, sometimes slowly and laboriously, come to grips with their power and understanding all that. In Sword and Sorcery, the character's already professional and ready to roll. It's
not a lot of self-doubt going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and of course the birth of Sword and Sorcery was when 1920, 1930s-ish with Robert
Well, it
Howard.
was in the pulp magazines.
In the pulp magazines,
So
right.
if you're writing for the magazines, you need to grab your reader from the first few sentences, or they're gonna. If you're just checking out the magazine, see if you want to buy it, you're gonna put the magazine back on the stand. Or if you've already purchased the magazine, you're not going to finish the story if it doesn't grab you in the first few paragraphs. But these things needed to seize you right from the get-go. There was no time for, I'll give it a couple of chapters and see if it builds speed. It's like, no. And that's one of the things I think most of us Sword and Sorcery writers are really keen on doing, is trying to grab your attention, get you interested right at the start.
And I mean, frankly, I think it's good advice for any storytelling.
Yeah.
You really should kind of grab them at the beginning. But we don't need to get into that.
Awesome. So, I think if we're lucky, we can cover like where Sword and Sorcery was, where it is, and maybe in the future if we could do. Let's kind of migrate to where Sword and Sorcery is perceived today, or how it has evolved into what is available now, and maybe we can compare or talk about that evolution from roughly 1930 to almost 100 years later. So. Which is kind of scary to say out loud. Actually, it didn't seem like 100 years ago. But I thought, Dedren, you got something on the evolution of Sword and Sorcery to what you can see today and what's available?
Right. I think to your point, I think it speaks to a space of humanity from we've had it, almost a century. It goes forward. Of course, I think my interjection of that is we're looking from the inclusion space of like Charles Saunders and Amaro. Being able to see where there was a captivating space of Conan and I think that high adventure component of Sword and Sorcery, but also looking at that there was other parts of the world that were yet to be explored, particularly from a character standpoint.
You say Warren Saunders? I'm not sure if everyone knows.
Charles Saunders.
So Charles Saunders, I think is who we would consider the progenitor, or really the father of Sword and Soul. The idea of Amaro as a African-born character that really, I think, had 3 epic fantasies. I think this is probably up from 1968 to mid-70s, but very much an allegory to a Conan, we'll kind of say, in an inclusive space, that in its time maybe wasn't as recognized, but in its passing,
He never got the recognition he deserved. He was a true talent, and it was my pleasure to have exchanged a number of emails with him over the years, and Yeah, he was a great guy. I'm sorry. Go
Oh,
on.
no, please, no, to that point. You know, I think in his passing, I think there's been more of a revelation of not only his work, but the spaces of influence that Mario and those characters had. And so I think that's where, with the advent of, say, Dungeons and Dragons as a gameplay, you know, a good gateway drug to the rest of these things, that now we've been able to see, I think, the renaissance of sword and sorcery and in these spaces really continue on to actually be as popularized as we've seen it from 80s and 90s to now.
Yeah, well, it's also nice too that oftentimes fantasy is critiqued for just being sort of European medieval-ish settings, and swords and sorceries always sort of buck that trend a little bit with the weird. And certainly when Charles Saunders was doing that stuff and bringing in, you know, like a fantastical African setting, I mean, that just opens the doors to more interesting landscapes and cultures. And so, yeah, I mean, we're seeing this progression. But I mean, really, what are the major beats you had? You had like Conan, and then you had
Lankhmar.
Lankhmar, Liber, and then we probably into Moorcock, and then where do we go after that?
Yeah,
Big
kind of.
beats.
Yeah, those were the biggest movers and shakers.
Yeah.
Most recently, I mean, arguably, you still had Sword and Sorcery associated with gaming. I mean,
Yeah.
the Gotrek and Felix novels, if you've read those, the Black Library, like those are Sword and
Absolutely.
Sorcery.
Yeah, it was William King, and then Nathan Long, and have some other people been writing them now?
Yeah, I think it's just Gotrek now, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
No spoilers, but it's just the Gotrek in it. But I was going to say that more recently, like contemporary Sword and Sorcery, like the independent presses, things that Tales from Magician's Skull, writers like Scott Odin, like it's interesting. I was talking to Howard last night. I realized people were still writing Sword and Sorcery through the blog called Grognardia, the old school Renaissance. So I'm wondering, I think there's like some genealogy there where like gaming, like independent gaming, kind of was taking off because of this and that, and then like people started reading the Appendix N, and there's this sort of interest in Sword and Sorcery that happened maybe like the early 2000s through today. I don't know, but I tend to suspect that the OSR and enthusiasm for Appendix N had something to do with the resurgence of interest in Sword and Sorcery.
And resurgence is an important thing to note, because for a long time there, it felt like Sword and Sorcery was moribund and impossible to find. And those of us who love to read it and write it had a hard time finding it anywhere. And I remember just being so frustrated. And now, for the first time in years, and it's not just this year, it's been in the last few years, there's building interest. There's more and more small press publishers and medium press publishers, and even Bain, a large publisher, is taking not just like slightly disguised Sword and Sorcery, but I mean, with my series, it's like they're proudly proclaiming, hey, this is Sword and Sorcery, come look.
Yeah.
Right. They're not trying to hide it anymore. And unfortunately what happened is when Conan got really big in the reprints, and they started those long line of Conan's novels that weren't written by Robert E. Howard.
Pastiche.
Yeah, the pastiche. Then everyone was doing big muscle dudes on the covers, and it almost became kind of a joke, an unfortunate parody of itself. And then no one wanted to read it because there was all this really, not to say that all of it was bad, but there was a lot of bad, sort of knockoff, unoriginal Sword and Sorcery, not going in any new directions.
Yeah, and it becomes like someone's idea of what Conan is, or like, which is fairly narrow, or like thinking it's a Deathstalker. That's not what Conan is, but the cheesecake image kind of flooded a bit, and so, it got less interesting.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to a question in 1 second. One thing that's interesting about a resurgence is in a moment we'll talk about a lot of the newer venues of where you can get some of the new types of flavors of Sword Sorcery, and maybe submit or just read from. At the same time, we, thanks to Rogue Signatures and stuff, we have kind of a interesting resurgence of some of the better pastiche, like John Hawking's City of the Dead.
Absolutely, oh my God, yes.
If you don't know about City of the Dead, you should look that up or write that down.
Yeah, two wonderful novels.
Yeah.
Long out of print, are finally available again, and that's some of the finest Conan pastiche ever written.
Yeah.
Highly recommended.
And widely available, right?
And the second part of that is Conan in the Living Plague.
Yeah, Conan and the Living Plague.
It had been kind of lost in public for a lot of publication issues for over 2 decades, maybe
Yeah.
more, and it's awesome, and so that's kind of a weird resurgence of something that should
Well,
have just been
there's-
out there years ago.
Heroic Signatures, the basically Robert E. Howard owners of that material, they're also releasing monthly stories, just shorts by various authors that feature Robert E. Howard's famous characters. That just got renewed for another year too. So again, you see that short format come in. You spend $2, you read it on your Kindle, and it's, I don't know, there's a lot of material out now. Almost,
yeah, there is.
Almost too much, but
Well,
that's not a bad thing.
Then let us not neglect the new Conan comic, which is just blowing all kinds
Yeah,
of
yeah.
records.
Yep.
It's beautifully drawn. It's incredibly well written, and it is selling like hotcakes. And I think it's bringing more and more readers into Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah, so we had a question back there?
Yeah, since you're bringing up pastiches of Conan, him being kind of like the archetypal character for this genre, as far as main characters for your stories, how would you separate your original characters, or are there any really good, unique ones that subvert the expectation of the characters that are copying Conan, basically? How do you make Sword Sorcery protagonist, who's usually always a straightforward, uncomplicated character, unique, I should say?
It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, I think our main example we have throughout like the history of Sword and Sorcery is Elric, right? Who is sort of a anti-Conan, right? Anyone else wants to speak on him, but Conan was muscle bound. His body would do anything he needed it to do, whereas Elric was kind of frail, dabbled in sorcery.
It was dependent on drugs for...
Yeah, dependent on drugs and like horrible entities to empower him. And so I think that turning it on its head, what Moorcock did there, is probably our biggest example of that. But I mean, as a modern author of these things, that's what I seek to do too, is to, you can have those same ingredients and those familiar character types, but you've got to do something a little different with it, like inject some sense of humor or some, maybe even a little personal doubt, right? If you have so many of those ingredients, then you can start playing with removal and adding different things in.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the authors talk about the elements you need in or you might expect from a sorcery story, but when it gets to the character, you have a lot of other choices to be non-Conan-like, right? So I want to go back, which is part of the inclusion, actually, which brings all this beauty in, because you think of, maybe you should talk about what some of the stuff you've already done, and maybe other people you see you're bringing different types of, non-traditional.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would think that there's a lot of that in the independent press, and I would think one of my mentors and good friends, Milton J. Davis, they also had a Space and Magician's Skull, and that I think emboldens that type of opportunity for like the character there, Changa the Jadeopolis, which is a series that Mr. Davis writes. And I would say for Changa as a character, it's just that the worldliness by which he and his blade travels is as a component. Because what I think is unique about that space of the world of Changa and his traveling compatriots is that they show a world that is more along the line of the Silk Road, that shows like a globalization of travel and trade that Changa travels through. And a lot of times we find, to get back to the localization of sword and sorcery, it just happens on a boat. And the idea is that they have a great perspective of the world where it's a lot more equality of classes, and going into different cultures and different languages is set as that's not necessarily in opposition, but the opposition ends up being in like more of the local dynamics, which again makes it feel very homey, but it's a big world that the character moves around in. And so I think in that sense, where Changa in that series really shines, and it also exists as a comic series with 133 art, is that I think it just helps bolster that world building that a lot of times we may miss when trying to make the change from sword and sorcery to large epic fantasy.
Well said.
Mm-hmm.
What was the name of that world again?
Oh, it is Changa, Changa, Changa and the Jadeopolis.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Because I wanna
please, yeah.
Put Howard on the spot and talk about Hanavar.
Yeah.
Because Hanavar,
Mhm.
so like the traditional sword and sorcery character, we tend to think, very violent, right? Aggressive, don't have a lot of compassion, and they're also kind of, Conan, like, let's find the next tavern to have a party, like, just kind of self-indulgent. And I think one of the interesting things about this character is Hanavar is very, he's not selfish at all. He's actually like very selfless. And his whole, one of the main elements of the character is like responsibility to his group of people who are kind of in this diaspora, which is a really intriguing take on the character. But also, Hanavar is very compassionate. I don't know if that's a fair, but he's definitely a deadly warrior, and there's a lot of interesting action scenes. But Hanavar is much more likely to engage you in a conversation, before the swords come out. So I think it's interesting to kind of invert this idea of like I'm going to get drunk and go fight and have dances with nudie women. You know what I mean? Like that can be. I think it's like this. There's this parody that's been inverted. Like acknowledge the parody and then flips. That's some thoughts I have about Hanavar.
Yeah, well, and again, it's a testament to like Howard's. Even though Hanavar might not be your typical sword and sorcery protagonist, even though arguably he kind of is too, it's the world. It's all the other ingredients that Howard's putting in there that makes it sword and sorcery, right? So you have, as long as you've got the ingredients, you can. That's kind of the key that keeps it as sword and sorcery, I think.
Yeah. One reason I think Hanavar. There's many reasons why Hanavar rocks. But he is a veteran, like general. So he's, as far as keeping the pace going, he has the terrible things that happened to his family and his whole country and stuff. But he already has all the experience and tools, I guess, in his mind to do a lot of great, action scenes and other stuff, from page one. But it's pretty cool to see the motivations turn on his head for that. Actually, why we're picking on Howard in a nice way. I'm thinking several years ago, I think maybe 10 years ago or so, you had like a blog post thinking, one thing that sword and sorcery needs or might be benefit from is like a polishing of the edge of the sword. I think it kind of needs either needs or is getting a new edge, and that actually turned into like a buzzword recently and turned into a magazine too with Oliver Brackenberry, New Edge Sword and Sorcery. Can you discuss the idea of the repolishing of the sword and the newer markets? Yeah.
Sure. When I was helming a little e-zine called Flashing Swords, me and John Chris Hawking and Clint Worthner and I think William King was involved in the discussions as well. We were all talking about, what is sword and sorcery doing now? And what can we do? And it's like, well, we can take the exciting stuff from the past and leave the suspect racism and politics behind us. Take the pacing and the excitement and the forward momentum and the interesting world building and leave the other stuff behind and move forward.
Yeah, and like New Edge Sword and Sorcery as a magazine kind of trips over itself to include other folks who may not have been, like Dedren was saying before. We have to do some work to make sure that those who are marginalized or weren't included previously are getting a spot at the table to do this thing. And so even just, I'm not that young, I'm 42, but even just the short period of time, the decade or so I've been bumping around in this fandom, things have changed, and it's not a sterile demographic who's consuming and writing. So this is great.
So I hear what all you're saying, but like the big thing is that Sword and Sorcery really feels like a distinctly American phenomenon. If you guys, are you aware of any other sort of how it's kind of coming out across the globe in other formats? Either adjacent, not necessarily Sword and Sorcery, could be, I know that over in England they're having another research of weird fiction. I'm a little bit surprised that you have mentioned Berserk.
Oh, Berserk, yeah. Which actually Monolith is doing a board game for them. If that's interesting to you down the road. Interesting. Well, first of all, New Age Sword and Sorcery is actually a Canadian publication. I'm a Canadian author too, but
part of North America.
We are not just North America.
And I published a number of English and European writers in Tales from the Magician's Skull as it was going along.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that, sorry, go ahead.
No, there is also a huge Sword and Sorcery fandom in Portugal. There's, I don't know his last name. My friend Marco is like, he has a podcast. He has he just did his PhD in history, and he brought in a lot of like Sword and Sorcery. I mean, it's actually like a literary history. It looked at Robert E. Howard's life, and he connects it to indigenous, kind of cultural themes in Sword and Sorcery. It's really intriguing. But they publish a lot of zines. They've actually been translating a lot of Robert E. Howard's work into Portuguese and publishing Portuguese editions. It's really like some of his ephemera too. So they're very serious. So I think it's fair to say there's a Sword and Sorcery fandom in Portugal.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the Berserk thing a little bit, because one of the things I have noticed is that, of course, Berserk highly influenced Dark Souls and the FromSoft mythos, and even walking around the GenCon floor, you either have your sort of squeaky clean, high fantasy look of stuff, or you've got that kind of grim dark, Dark Souls aesthetic going on. And there's another contemporary magazine too, a pro market called Old Moon Quarterly, who they lean right in to that sort of Soulsborne aesthetic, Berserk, and it's Swords and Sorcery. That's the title, Old Moon Quarterly, yeah. I have a story coming up soon.
Very nice.
Yay for me. But
They're a nice group of people.
they are, and it's a beautiful magazine, but if you're looking for that sort of aesthetic, that's there too. And I actually think that's, I just kind of had a light bulb moment as I was walking around GenCon thinking that might be this sort of inlet where Swords and Sorcery can latch onto that aesthetic, because it's hot right now. And it cooperates with traditional Sword and Sorcery as well.
Where's Grim Dark Magazine based out of?
Grimdark Magazine is Australia,
That's
and I
right.
mean, there's a lot of Venn diagram with Grimdark and Swords and Sorcery as well. Yeah, so I think that's kind of, when Grimdark became popular, I think a lot of Swords and Sorcery fans might have, or people who might have become them, gravitated toward that, and I don't know, we're in an interesting swirl at the moment.
Right.
By the way, can I make a correction real quick? Oh, nervous, not very good on panels. It was Brazil.
wonderful on panels.
It was Brazil, not Portugal. They speak Portuguese in Brazil.
You're good.
And we'll correct Jason. Jason kicks ass on panels.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll take this question, and then I'll make sure we'll talk about some of the other markets. So we're bringing them up quite naturally. Yeah, so you, sir?
So, early on, you talked about how Sword Sorcery is more like a break out of like the medieval European of epic fantasy, and there's talk about like the Silk Road, both China and the Jade Empire. But how do you avoid tripping into cultural appropriation or Orientalism while still trying to maintain that sense of the weird and fantastic?
I'd say write it from your heart and know the material. I'm writing sort of an ancient Mediterranean, sort of a Roman Carthage kind of thing. So I guess us Americans are from the Europeans, which is kind of from Rome, but we're not kind of from Carthage, so I could be accused of appropriation. I'm just trying to write it from my heart and soak it up and make these people human. Not archetypes, but make them human. And I think maybe that's make them real people.
Yeah, and avoid tokenism, and like do a little homework on the sort of like things that have been done in the past, which have just created a bad taste. But I agree fully with, like, you got to write from the heart, and I don't know, it's kind of absurd if you're going to present an entire world to never write something from other points of view or walks of life. But I mean, you can talk to other writers and people in your life, and if you're doing it from the heart with the best intentions, I don't think you're going to run afoul. I don't think you're going to.
The more you lean toward trying to have it be presented as historical fiction, you will need to be more sensitive, and the more you put more of a fantastic and change the names, you might buy some more ground on that, because it'll be more obvious that it's fantasy. I'm thinking there are some authors now that do that. I think like Greg Melee has a nice Mesoamerican.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't remember the name of this overarching tales for that. And then I'm trying to think, who wrote Oba? Was it Clint?
Clint.
Yeah. And so he managed to do a convincing Oriental, not Ronin, but close to Ronin.
And I
type of
Well,
Oriental.
it's not actual Japan. It's sort of like a re-envisioned. It's a Japan-like fantasy secondary world setting, but
Right.
Well, and when we have all of these different publications opening their doors to traditionally underrepresented writers and settings and things like that, it's I feel like there's a little more freedom for us all to relax a little because we have those points of view coming in regularly. So it's not that anyone's closed out, if that makes sense. I don't know.
yeah, it does feel like modern sword and sorcery is more welcoming.
Yeah.
That there's more of us at the table from different walks of
If
life.
we think of, I know, I'd like to discuss some of these other venues. One I'll call out is the great panelist Jason Carney over here with Whetstone. He is one of, I think, I'll highlight that first, I think, and you should talk. I'll give a preamble to which is why I like it, but it also is kind of an associated Discord too, which helps build the community.
It is. It's the
It's
Discord.
like
the Whetstone Discord is a wandering gathering spot of people who love sword and sorcery and aren't there to argue, but are there to share and find out more detail. And he's the man who started it up.
Yeah, and it's kind of associated with the Whetstone magazine. So if you are in this community, you should try out the Discord. Jason, you should talk about Whetstone and for a moment. And also, while I have you, you also just kind of hosted a SpiralCon, which is kind of associated with it. So this is a good time to talk about that.
Oh, yeah, so the whole thrust was amateurism. I studied between the wars pulp writers, and they were part of amateur press associations. They were corresponding with each other. They were visiting each other. There was this it was like the writers were working together, and then they were like honing their crafts, but the business elements, like the editors, the relationship with the editors, like the editors in the business offices was like were separate. So there was this kind of like fandom / working community. I tried to. I know that exists on the internet, but that was my thing. With I wanted Whetstone to be a amateur. I think we asked for 1,500 words. 2,500 words.
2,500.
2,500 words.
Tough.
It is tough. Yeah.
Just you get an honorarium. It's published as a PDF. It's always going to be free. It's just a way for you to, I had a lot of friends who read Sword and Sorcery, thought about Sword and Sorcery, were kind of scholars and fan writers who never would actually try to write because it's really hard to get published. Like if you send Sword and Sorcery to a lot of these spec magazines, they're not interested in it. So but as I'll tie a bow on this. As a writer, you sometimes need to see your name in print. You need to get feedback from an editor.
Yes.
You need to get somebody to read your story and say, I like that, for you to keep at it. And so that was the idea behind Whetstone. It was we're getting about 2,000 downloads per issue, right? So people are reading it, so it's really cool. And then sometimes people review it on their blogs. It's not like a major professional publication, but it kind of pays homage to those, those kind of more amateur zine communities of the 60s and 70s and 80s.
And it's free. I mean, that's the other thing. There's a lot of, a lot of us are selling, hustling this material, but they're like the Rogues in the House podcast. We do that for free, and mainly it's there to boost signals of contemporary authors, or just for us to talk about the things that we like, whether it's movie reviews, blah blah blah. And then of course, Whetstone is absolutely free as well, and you can just sample Swords and Sorcery on your lunch break on your phone. It's awesome. So it's a challenge of making sure the word gets out. But I'm really thrilled with how much of a sort of fellowship we've got in this community that we've been working on for a few years. So the future's bright.
Help me out here. I'm thinking of some other venues. I know there's a Swords and Sorcery magazine is another online magazine, which is
yeah, that one's free too, right?
It's free, and
don't forget Heroic Fantasy.
That's free.
Also free.
We all know about, we just heard, and we should reiterate, Battleborn is coming up.
Anvil 2.
And Anvil 2.
Yeah, if you have aspirations to just try and hit a market and try your hand at writing a story, I mean, Crimson Quill Quarterly is one that's out. There are quite a few. So if you want to try
Realms is another.
Yeah, Savage Realms. There's.
And Sova's open.
What's that?
Sova's
open.
open.
Sova's yeah, great, yeah. And then there's, of course, we mentioned New Edge Sword and Sorcery, which is taken off. They usually go through Kickstarter.
There's a question back there, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. Do you feel that sword and sorcery gets stereotyped a bit more than other genres of fantasy? Because
Yeah.
a lot of people always think of Conan and think of him as a big muscle man that just Arnold Schwarzenegger. But a lot of the early Howard stories, like Howard of the Elephant, are very emotional and philosophical even. So do you think everyone just focuses on the pastiche and doesn't actually think about the deeper story?
Well, here's the thing. I think 20 years ago it was more stereotyped. Now, if you talk sword and sorcery, people don't even know what it means anymore.
Yeah.
If
Harry
wander-
Potter.
Yeah. If you wander online, people think any story with a sword and some magic in it is now sword and sorcery. So they'll talk Brandon Sanderson. Nothing against Brandon Sanderson, but that's epic fantasy.
Yeah.
That is not sword and sorcery pacing. That's not sword and sorcery magic.
Which I think is why like that New Edge label is helpful, because it shows there is a new element to kind of just key into. It's not stories that contain a sword and sorcery.
Right.
There's more to it.
Right. I think role-playing games started slapping sword and sorcery on there, and movies, critics started discussing any movie that was fantasy as sword and sorcery.
Yeah.
And so popular culture out there doesn't even really distinguish how sword and sorcery is different from any other kind of fantasy. And I think it's actually difficult to discuss sword and sorcery and have people know what you're talking about.
What happened to me yesterday at Author Alley? I was like, they're like, okay, what do you like to read? I'm like, I like to read Sword and Sorcery. And like, oh, you will love this. It's like a D&D campaign that you read. And I was like, that sounds awful. Just to me, I think it's great. It's totally legit that you do it. I was just like, that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
As kind of piggybacking off this, it's one of the things that makes Sword and Sorcery really what it is its tone. Absolutely, you mentioned like grimdark is, even though that's a separate thing, like it sets the idea in the imagination immediately. Are there ways to make Sword and Sorcery with a tone that's like, I don't know, even sometimes I think optimism is not the word I associate with the genre very often, but as soon as you start getting away from it, is it still Sword and Sorcery, or is it just another form of fantasy?
No, I think it's sword and sorcery. I mean, my character's in really dark circumstances, but he's got integrity, and he believes in his mission, and he's trying to do good things. So he's kind of an optimist against all odds. But I think he's still clearly a sword and sorcery hero. It's the atmosphere and the writing style, but I think you can put all kinds of characters in these roles.
Yeah. Well, and certainly if you just think of Leiber's fiction too, right? There's a levity and a humor and a buddy cop angle.
But they can also be quite moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is it Ilmet and Longmire where they lose their...
Oh my God, yeah.
Like it gets dark, but you really can, you can kind of fluctuate a little. I think. Yeah.
There's room for...
Yeah.
There's room for...
We can build on that in a second. I mean, I like when it always reminded me more like a Scooby-Doo thing. It was dark, but it was kind of funny, and didn't get too serious. As far as that's a good point about different types of emotions you might get, and to people you kind of picture the horror and the grim and kind of be. So if you didn't want to do horror and grim and you wanted a different a feeling to come across, so I guess there is levity. There's not a ton of there could be other emotions too, but I'm trying to think of non. For the sake of the questioner, non-grim, feelings.
I think you can have like, at least this is what I tried, is like introspection, kind of like thoughtfulness.
Yeah.
The story I got published in Tales from the Magician's Skull, I had been reading a bunch of, I've been reading Thich Nhat Hanh's memoir, and it was so like there's like a meditative quality to a lot of Sword and Sorcery, like the character like is kind of thinking about their relationship to deep time. So it's not necessarily dark, it's more just like it can be thoughtful and kind of philosophical.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm going to shut up because I've been sucking a lot of oxygen here, but this book and the stories that I have written are very much representative of the life I've lived over the last 5 years. It has been riddled with some tragedy and some upheaval, and like within those pages is the story of me losing my brother to the most vicious of diseases, and also my wife and I adopting kids out of nowhere and coming to grips with what that means. And so you've got a protagonist here who's, he's kind of a drunkard sometimes. He's a bit of a badass. He's out for himself, but then he ends up kind of being a protector of children and like also helping out a total bastard. And it's like, I don't think there's any particular themes you can't touch. It's about
No, it has to be a barbarian and a fur diaper.
Fur diaper barbarian,
That's
evil
all.
wizard, scantily clad ladies. That's it.
All right, I gotta bring this up. I think you should fully embrace the other feelings you might want, the feelings you want out of a story, and go toward that, especially if it's different, because that'll make you feel better, and even readers too, because it'll be more unique. So, one last question, and then
Very fast. I'm reminded of an author I used to read a long time ago, like back when I was in junior high school, named Lynn Carter.
Oh yeah.
Right, and he was straight up comedy, and I was just wondering whether you think Sword and Sorcery is conducive to straight up comedy like that.
I think it can be.
Because Lynn Carter's stuff was hilarious.
And he could also write some pretty good stuff. Some of the Thongor short stories, I think.
I love Thongor.
Yeah, I'm not as wild about the Thongor novels, but it's got that Barosian pacing, and some people love that Barosian pacing. But some of the Thongor short stories and some of his sort of Dunsany-esque short stories, I dig those. So yeah.
Jack Vance can be funny too.
Jack Vance is funny. Yeah.
Okay, so we have like 5 minutes to wrap up, and I want to make sure you guys all have a chance to do a quick summary of on things. Actually, let's do that first.
And then take a couple questions, maybe.
No, I don't know. But if you can just talk maybe about things you're involved with in the future, and kind of summarize stuff in like a minute each. Sure. Time to say goodbye, but also tell people about other opportunities and stuff you're involved in. Dedren, you're up.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate everyone's time and connectivity on this panel. It's great to see other reading humans that do love this stuff. And so for me, in my work, based out of Atlanta, but I work for Sorghum and Spear. I found it online, and I think for me, what's next is got an anthology with some of our amazing panelists in run, but you can find us online at subsumestudios.com and sorghumandspear.com, and just going to be working on my tabletop game and more stories from here. Thank y'all.
Yeah, if you're interested, Spiral Tower Press, just Google Spiral Tower Press. We have an APA, it's an Amateur Press Association, where you write up two pages, and you send it to an editor, and then they collate it into a magazine that then goes out as a PDF. That's a really good way of there's not even an editor. You just connect the readers that way. So we have the APA. It's called TriAPA. And we have currently we have a Witch House, which is a Cosmic Horror zine. And we have a Waystation, which is a space opera zine, and then there's the Discord. It's just kind of a community.
And the Discord is Whetstone? Is a keyword to look for?
If you go to the Whetstone Sword and Sorcery,
And that's with an H, Whetstone.
Yeah.
Quit.
If you go to the webpage, you'll find a link to join the Discord.
And it's a wonderful Discord. I mean that seriously. It's not where people are always arguing with each other. It's very welcoming and warm. And the what do they call them? The Sentinels, the people who watch.
Moderators.
They watch the moderators. Yeah, the moderators will crack down the people who are trying to discuss politics or just be pinheads. Yeah, and they'll get them out of there or quiet them down. It's a really awesome place.
Yeah. Time to say goodbye though.
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, so you can find me at howardandrewjones.com, but I've been so busy writing Hanavar, I haven't been updating it very much. So the first 2 books of the 5 Hanavar books are out now in both hardback and paperback. Book 3 is coming in October, and I'm pretty much writing Hanavar all the time. I'm working on book 4 right now, and they're doing well enough that they may give me just a couple more. I don't want to turn this into like some 18-book series, but I'm having so much fun writing Hanavar, I might want to write like 1 or 2 more to close out the sequence. But I am going to bring it to an end, and each one reads almost like a season of television, because they're full of individual episodes that build toward a season climax. And one of the nice things I hear people when they read it's like, oh yeah, I can read one story and feel satisfied that evening.
Yeah.
Okay, you got about 30 seconds.
Well, I would segue in my book's sort of like that too. You can just read bite-sized bits. Rogues in the House podcast, if you like to listen to that sort of thing. Rogues in the House Presents is our website. We publish a few anthologies called The Book of Blades. If you're into the gaming and Conan stuff all over the place, I got a few copies of this book. If you want it, it's available on Amazon to Walk on Worlds.
Awesome. So I want to thank the speakers, and then actually I have a surprise giveaway of a book, so don't leave yet. So thank everybody.
Well, just if anyone has a question after the panel and you're hanging out,
Yeah.
you could say hi. I'd
Yeah.
still
You got a
continue
couple
to
of
talk.
minutes until
I got
throw you
free
out.
bookmarks if you
Yeah.
want.
All right, so we have here is draw, pick one, quickly. All right, I should explain what you're about to win. So we have a book here from Jason M. Wall, so a lot of us know him. He's been writing really cool anthologies for the last couple of decades. Return of the Sword is one of the first ones that you should really check out. Hit the whole lineup of different type, Rogue Blades Entertainment and Rogue Blades Foundation. He's been very active in the Robert E. Howard sphere. So I got a couple extra books sent to me by accident. I said I'm going to give one away. So this is a very new collection that just came out of Neither Beg Nor Yield. And if you want it, it's going to go to Michael Whitlow. Are you here? There you go.
Congratulations.
Okay, so that is going to conclude this.